What place should faith have in a secular society? In the mid-19th century, it seemed that religions were going to disappear. Science, knowledge, reason all seemed to be detrimental to the religious soul of the West that had dominated through the Middle Ages. Auguste Comte prophesied the arrival of a new era, the era of positivism. Humanity, now mature, had come of age and would now leave the dark times behind in order to live in the era of absolute progress, marked by the scientific ideals of positivism. Some sociologists announce that religion would not survive the 20th century and that they would become a residual phenomena on their way to extinction. And yet, this new millennia, just born, has made a fool of the prideful prophecies of Comte and the now stale rationalism. For decades, we have been witnessing what Gilles Kepel has called God's revenge. The attack on everything related to religion that was characterized as the inheritance of the Enlightenment, today must be seen in different light. It took 2 world wars, Auschwitz, and the atomic bombs for us to realize that, as Adorno and Horkheimer uttered, the Enlightenment is totalitarian. The Enlightenment's attempt to explain, to give reason, and to understand everything, this secularized rationalism, ended up eliminating too large a part of reality. Part of that life repressed by the rationalist totalitarianism of modernity was the world of religion. This is why, when the dream of modernity failed, religions reappeared on the scene. The Spanish theologian Juan José Tamayo Acosta says that in these times of diversity, multiculturalism, and globalization, it is sterile and counterproductive to fight religions head-on in an indiscriminate way with an anti-religious attitude. These attitudes are as outdated as some of the ways which are intended to fight religion, and end up leading directly to attitudes of self-defense that often lead to fundamentalism, fanaticism, and sectarianism. The Chilean sociologist Christian Parker says something similar. Regimes that repress religious sentiments or that violate the values of faith could generate intolerant responses from the faithful. You cannot block out the sun with your hands. Religions, once again, occupy a place of importance in sociocultural debates. But a new question has arisen in this new global scenario. What place will religions have in today's societies? The question is no longer, should we have religion or not, as it may have been in the past. Rather, the question today is, how should we have religion in society? And if so, how much of it? Both in Europe and in the Americas, such a question resonates particularly around the Christian faith, which carries centuries of tradition and a new historical time that is usually called post-Christian. The time of Christian religious hegemony in Europe and the Americas is over. And when we get into this question, very heated debate immediately ensues, and it has to do with the relationship of the church and the state. In the past, the Christian faith was the backbone of medieval Europe and the colonial Americas, 2 social organizations that today are deeply criticized and seen as part of a past that must not be repeated. Yet, what kind of relationship will Christianity have today? What kind of relationship will it have with the public sphere, in the realm of politics, and especially with the state in these times? This question appears time and again in contemporary debates. Among the advocates of church and state separation, believers and non-believers alike, the main argument is long-standing, the desire to confine religion to the private sphere. Where does this idea come from, though? For this, we have to go back to the time of the French Revolution. For many reasons in European history, the political configuration that led to the French Revolution had a distinct anti-clerical sentiment. This attitude profoundly marked the collective conscience about the correct way to approach religion in a secularized society. But what few know is that anti-clericalism of the French Revolution was not directed at the whole church or as a specific religious motif. On the contrary, it was specifically directed against the Roman Curia, the tens of thousands from above, as they were referred to, as opposed to the 130,000 French Catholic clergy who were in France at the time. In fact, there was a large part of the lower clergy, the priests closest to the popular demands, who who at the beginning collaborated very actively in this social rupture that led to the French Revolution. Despite everything, this anti-religious prejudice has persisted until today and has continued to grow in Western societies, even though social-political circumstances have changed enormously from the 18th century to today. Associating religion with the private sphere is a legacy of the Enlightenment, which considers that the very idea of the public expression of religions as a permanent risk to society. This is a fear that positions a constant threat that the old regime and the Middle Ages will reappear on the scene. This is the first part of a 6-part video essay in which I want to reflect on the relationship between Christians and the temporal powers, the state. This is an adaptation from my book La Traición Suprema, Triunfo y Vergüenza del Cristianismo en el Poder, or in English, The Ultimate Betrayal, The Triumph and Shame of Christianity in Power, illustrated by Almendra Fantilli and published by Ediciones del Altillo at the end of 2019. Countless books have been written on this topic, and a great deal of thought has been given to the dialogue between faith and politics. But more than relying on fashionable political theories or on the old prejudices of the Enlightenment, I'd like to look at the example of Jesus and the testimony of the first Christians for some ways that allow us to reconstruct a model of action that can remain relevant in the 21st century. We often speak of Christianity as if it were a term with a definitive and single meaning. I believe that on the contrary, it is convenient to speak of Christianities in the plural, since the history of this faith reveals a diversity of meanings, possibilities, tendencies, and contradictions. Should we judge the Christian faith based on its developments in the Middle Ages, or perhaps its participation in colonialism? But on the other hand, how do we account for the Anabaptists, John Wesley, William Wilberforce, Martin Luther King Jr., Oscar Romero, Enrique Angelelli, or Desmond Tutu as part of that Christian tradition? How do we then evaluate the contributions of Christianity to today's society if history abounds in good and bad examples? In order to have an orientation in the midst of all this chaos, it is necessary to look at the origin, at the beginning of the Christian hope, at the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth and his preaching of the kingdom of God, and at the early church and its announcement of the lordship of Christ. We will begin by talking about this in the following section. But before we continue, I ask you to consider these questions. What place do you think Christianity should have in a post-Christian society? Do you think that religion should remain only in the private sphere? What do you think of the separation of church and state?